Thank you very much, Program Director Mr. Zahir Laye from Terco. I acknowledge Ambassador Muhammad, the permanent representative of Malaysia. I wish to acknowledge Ms. Beatrice Finn, the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I wish to acknowledge Mr. Joel Amoti, Head of ICRC, stationed here in Pretoria. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my honor and great privilege to open this very important dialogue entitled the African Regional Seminar on the universalization of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, commonly known as the TPNW. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my submission that the TPNW is a landmark agreement in the history of nuclear disarmament and is a crucial element in our collective efforts to rid the world of these horrendous weapons of mass destruction. What makes the treaty even more significant, ladies and gentlemen, is the critical role that Africa states have played during the open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament that ultimately culminated in the negotiation and adoption of the TPNW by the vast majority of UN member states in July 2017. Distinguished participants, South Africa has always emphasized the humanitarian consequence of the use of nuclear weapons, as well as the humanitarian imperatives that underpin our search for a world without the threat posed by the possession, use and proliferation of nuclear weapons. For a majority of non-nuclear armed states, especially Africa states, the risks of the use of nuclear weapons and the scale of the humanitarian consequences that would follow makes nuclear disarmament an important priority. The TPNW is the result of the increased focus by the international community on the catastrophic consequences of any nuclear weapon explosion, which is the culmination of the humanitarian initiative on nuclear weapons launched in 2010. The TPNW and the humanitarian initiative, ladies and gentlemen, emerged in response to the permanence and prevalence of nuclear weapons in global politics, the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament, and the concomitant risk which is systematic in a nuclear war. The current security environment allows no room for procrastination. It is our submission that humanity cannot afford to wait for the appropriate or the right time before doing away with nuclear weapons. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, nuclear disarmament is not just an international legal obligation, but is evidently a moral and ethical imperative. Distinguished participants, South Africa's own experience has shown that neither the possession nor the pursuit of nuclear weapons can enhance international peace and security. The continued retention of nuclear weapons on the basis of perceived security interests of some states comes at the expense of the rest of humanity. It is our submission, ladies and gentlemen, that the TPNW can be understood as challenging the narrative expressed by nuclear-armed states and their supporters that claim nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and their potential use are legitimate and necessary. The TPNW does this by taking into consideration the security concerns of all states under the auspices of the United Nations. For South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, the negotiation and entry into force of the TPNW, as well as the Africa Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, or the Pelindaba Treaty, is a true reflection of what Africa states have achieved in pursuance of our common security objectives. Distinguished guests, both of these treaties provide tangible security benefits to all of us, as it is our submission that they effectively ban nuclear weapons while recognizing the right of state parties to utilize the atom for peace, as well as to make full use of nuclear technologies to enhance, ladies and gentlemen, the social and economic development. Distinguished participants, the universalization of the TPNW maximizes the authority of the treaty and its core norms and principles. It is therefore our hope that discussions today and tomorrow will continue to highlight that the universalization of the TPNW not only comprises increasing number of signatures and ratifications, but perhaps more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, that it actually promotes the underlying rationale of the total and complete elimination of nuclear weapons due to their inherent risks and catastrophic humanitarian consequences. It is our submission, ladies and gentlemen, that the universalization of the TPNW could further trigger changes on nuclear disarmament, especially in the policies of nuclear-armed states and states under extended nuclear security guarantees. This is leverage that as African non-nuclear weapon states, we can bring to bear on those who is ongoingly reliant on nuclear weapons. Distinguished participants, as preparations for the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW continues, it is important for African states to continue to play and assume a leading role as the stage is set at this very early juncture for the future implementation of the treaty. Participation as observers by African states not party to the treaty would provide an eloquent opportunity to reaffirm their commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons. As I have already pointed out earlier on, as African states, we continue to play an important role in the development, negotiation, and the adoption of the TPNW. It therefore holds, ladies and gentlemen, that as African states, we have a very formidable role to play by voting in favor of relevant resolutions before the UN General Assembly, UNGA. These actions are an important way for African states that are not yet party to the treaty to signal political support for and a potential stepping stone to move towards joining the TPNW. Ladies and gentlemen, every single additional ratification contributes to the strengthening of the treaty's norms and principles, and it further underscores the delegitimization of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. Bearing in mind the current international instability, which is bolstered by the continued existence and threat of use of nuclear weapons, we thus wish to call on all of you to utilize this seminar to engage the experts present and gain from the experiences of those that have already rectified the TPNW. Ladies and gentlemen, this is also an important opportunity to obtain useful information that would enable your governments to ratify the treaty at the earliest possible opportunity and thus reasserts Africa's leadership in nuclear disarmament and contributing to international peace and security. With these brief remarks, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open this seminar and encourage all participants to engage in robust and critical discussions and demonstrate your collective and unwavering commitment towards a world that is peaceful, that is stable, secure, and prosperous as we journey together, ladies and gentlemen, in ensuring that we construct the peaceful Africa and a secure world order. Thank you very much.
Deputy Minister, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me first begin by thanking the Department of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, and of course also the International Committee of the Red Cross for co-hosting this seminar with ICANN. And I also really want to thank every one of you all here for traveling here to tackle one of the most pressing challenges of our time, the elimination of nuclear weapons. And we are having this meeting right now in a particularly worrying time. War is raging in Ukraine, and tension among the nuclear armed states are extraordinarily high. For the first time in many years, we are faced with the very real and deeply concerning possibility of a nuclear weapon being used in conflict. In 1945, it took just 2 atomic bombs, small by today's standards, to obliterate the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing more than 250,000 people. And we must do everything in our power to prevent such atrocity from ever being committed again. Just a week ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the minute hand of its doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight, a sobering wake-up call to humanity. The world is teetering at the brink of catastrophe, and urgent action is needed for peace and disarmament. It is unacceptable that 9 countries continue to possess close to 13,000 nuclear weapons between them, threatening every single country in the world's security. Because no one is immune to the devastating harm that these most horrific weapons could unleash at any moment. Even if just one single nuclear weapon was used today, the dead and injured would be numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly the millions, and the consequences would be felt well beyond the war zone in which the weapons are detonated. Radiation, which is silent and invisible, would cross national boundaries. Millions would flee the area of impact, seeking haven in other countries. And humanitarian organizations would be powerless to respond in any meaningful way to the horrifying aftermath of the attack. Even more alarming, other nuclear armed states might opt to use their own nuclear forces in response, resulting in a nuclear exchange with a death toll orders of magnitude greater. Soot from the burning cities would block the sun's rays, leading to widespread agricultural collapse and famine. This is the stark reality of what nuclear weapons can do and what they are designed to do. Thousands are poised for the use at any moment in missile silos, on submarines, on bombers, at around 100 locations. And we know that the only way to prevent this use is to eliminate these weapons. A moment of international crisis like the present one can be a moment for action, and it must be. Action to rid this world of this menace once and for all, and to build lasting peace among nations. We must urgently end the arms race and start a race for nuclear disarmament. 6 years ago, the international community took a major step in this direction by adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. 122 states supported the adoption, including 42 in Africa. And just last week, we celebrated the 2nd anniversary of the treaty's entry into force. This treaty will not get rid of all nuclear weapons overnight. It cannot produce miracles, but it is our best hope of eventually eliminating the worst weapon. African states are rightly proud of the role they played in the TPNW's negotiations and adoption. Support for the treaty in this region is universal, even if much work remains to be done to bring all states on board as parties. All 54 African states that are UN members have expressed their support for the TPNW, either by voting to adopt it in 2017 or by voting in favor of the annual UN General Assembly resolution calling for the treaty to be universalized. And I really commend the 15 African states that have already signed and ratified the TPNW. Your principled leadership serves as an inspiration to others. And ICANN looks forward to working with you to promote universal adherence to the treaty as required by Article 12. And I also commend the 18 African states that have signed the TPNW as a first step towards becoming states parties, including most recently Djibouti, Burkina Faso, Equatorial Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And we will support and encourage these 18 states to complete the ratification processes as speedily as possible. And to the remaining 21 states in Africa, I hope that you will see the great merit in pursuing signature and ratification of this important treaty with urgency. Because each new signature and ratification makes the TPNW stronger. It strengthens the global norm against the use and possession of nuclear weapons, contributing to international peace and security. And it makes nuclear war less likely. And I would also like to take the opportunity to convey my thanks and appreciation to the many civil society organizations in Africa, including those that are ICANN partners, that are working tirelessly to raise public awareness of the TPNW and to promote its universalization. At the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, held in Vienna last June, the states parties resolved to pursue universalization as a priority. And they pledged not to rest until the last state has joined the treaty, the last warhead has been dismantled and destroyed, and nuclear weapons have been totally eliminated from the earth. And the dates of the second meeting of states parties have now been set for November this year in New York. And if your state is not yet a state party, I would encourage you to make every effort to ensure that it is a state party in time for this important meeting. We must not allow the nuclear armed states to continue wielding for decades to come what Nelson Mandela once described as a terrible and terrifying weapon of mass destruction. They are not entitled to do so and have never been. On the contrary, they are legally obligated to pursue negotiations in good faith for nuclear disarmament and have failed to fulfill that requirement, undermining everyone's security. As more and more states join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, those states that still cling on to these despicable weapons will feel more and more pressure to live up to their legal obligations and to conform to the new international norm. Peace can never be achieved through the ever-present threat of mutual annihilation. It is beyond time that the so-called great powers of the world move beyond this Cold War mentality and the deeply flawed concepts of nuclear deterrence. There's nothing great or clever or strategic about threatening to obliterate cities. In fact, to quote Setsuko Thurlow, a survivor of the US atomic bombing in Hiroshima, the development of nuclear weapons signifies not a country's elevation to greatness, but its descent to the darkest depth of depravity. An international system where a small handful of states can wield earth-endangering weapons while occupying permanent seats at the UN Security Council and dictating to others what to do and not to do is manifestly unjust. It is what the late Desmond Tutu once called nuclear apartheid. As he wrote in 2011, we must not tolerate a system of nuclear apartheid in which it is considered legitimate for some states to possess nuclear arms, but patently unacceptable for others to seek to acquire them. Such double standard is no basis for peace and security in the world. And the TPNW brings an end to this double standard. It fills a gap in international law, and it applies the same rules to all states, regardless of the size and status in world affairs. It promises not only a more peaceful future, but also a fairer one. So let me thank you once again for joining us here in Pretoria, and I look forward to our discussions over the coming 2 days and to celebrating further signatures and ratifications of the TPNW over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you for ICANN's leadership in promoting the treaty and its signature and ratification. Your tireless efforts are crucial for the universalization of the treaty. We'll now hear from Jules Amoti, the head of delegation of the ICRC in Pretoria. Thank you. Jules.
His Excellency Alvin Gotz, Deputy Minister of Department of International Relations and Cooperation for the South African Government, Ms. Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of ICANN, Excellencies, Government Representative and expert from across Africa, representative of the African Union and Southern African Development Communities, members of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all. On behalf of the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, I warmly welcome you of attending this important event today in this room. Nuclear weapons are one of the biggest threats to humanity. Their catastrophic humanitarian consequences for all life on our planet are today well known, and so the immense risk their continued existence entail to the world. The complete elimination of nuclear weapons is a very urgent humanitarian imperative, and for all those states that are part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which many of you in this room are, it is also a very legal obligation and duty. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons for the first time prohibit nuclear weapons on a global scale. We really insist on the global scale, meaning not limited to one region or another. This history of regulation of other weapons of mass destruction has shown that the prohibition of weapons is a first necessary step to their elimination across the world. Of course, as every treaty, the TPNW can only bind its state parties. It is therefore a paramount importance that as many members of the international community as possible join the treaty without delay. The larger the membership, the stronger the treaty legal and political force. Africa's role in the entry into force of the TPNW cannot be overstated. African states actively participated in negotiation of the TPNW, starting together as regional bloc to call for a prohibition of nuclear weapons. On 7 July 2017, 42 African states voted in favor of the adoption of the TPNW, reaffirming the continent's strong commitment to a world free of these weapons. To date, 15 African states have ratified the treaty and another 18 have signed it. Now African states can and must advance the implementation of the objective of the TPNW by contributing to its universalization. Ladies and gentlemen, since 1945, the international community, the International Red Cross and Red Cross Crescent movement has been calling for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. The ICRC and the Japanese Red Cross witnessed firsthand the unspeakable suffering caused by the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, being present on spot to support those who have been affected. And it was so hard to bring relief to the dying and to injure people in these specific locations. The entry into force of the TPNW is the beginning, not the end of our efforts. These efforts are more necessary than ever in the face of recent development, as the adoption of more aggressive nuclear weapons doctrines threat of use of nuclear weapons and the continued modernization of nuclear weapons and arsenal all point towards an increasing risk of usage, as we all know. It is therefore important to remember that the principle and rule of international humanitarian law apply to nuclear weapons. The ICRC legal analysis and new evidences on data on the catastrophic direct and indirect effect of the nuclear detonation on the life and health of individuals and on the environment point to a clear conclusion. It is extremely difficult and doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in an armed conflict in accordance with the principle and the rules of the international humanitarian law. Joining the TPNW is therefore essential, also has a meaningful way of promoting the compliance with the international humanitarian law. As we will discuss more during this seminar, the TPNW is an intrinsic part of the broader nuclear disarmament goal, along with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the regional treaties establishing zone-free from nuclear weapons and all the weapons of mass destructions across the world, which it complements and reinforces. In Africa, this includes the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty, or what is known as Pelindaba Treaty, which established the African continent as a region free of nuclear weapons, and which has to date been ratified by 41 African states and signed by an additional 10 African states. The TPNW, for the most part, goes beyond such existing instruments by prohibiting outright the use of nuclear weapons and by foreseeing measures to redress the harm caused by nuclear weapons use and testing on people and the environment. The first meeting of state parties to the TPNW, which took place in June of last year, adopted a strong political declaration and an ambitious action plan that will frame the implementation of the treaty in the coming years. I would like to congratulate South Africa for co-chairing the treaty's working group on universalization. As state parties to the TPNW, universalization has two aspects. A tangible one, which is of course the treaty membership, but also an intangible one, which is about bringing and keeping the treaty's main message at the head of nuclear disarmament debate. The catastrophic consequences of a nuclear weapon use, the unacceptable risk of a deliberate and accidental detonation, and the legal, moral, and ethical incompatibility of the horrific weapons of mass destructions. We call of you, African states, to contribute to both this aspect of universalization. Joining the TPNW means strengthening the taboo against nuclear weapons, furthering the objects and purpose of the Pelindaba Treaty, implementing the NPT long-neglected Article 6, which calls for effective measures on nuclear disarmament, and promoting respect for a compliance with IHL, and ultimately safeguarding humanity's common future. The ICRC strongly encourages all states that have not done so to ratify or adhere to the TPNW without delay. We stand ready to support you at every step of this process. As we gather here in this hall, let's contribute effectively to building a world free of threat of nuclear weapons against us, against our loved one, against our nations, against our environment, and against our future generations. I thank you all.